Jungkook roared at his manager who was gazing down. And with those words, he ended the call and threw his cell phone against the wall. Manager was dumbfounded. Jungkook was acting so strange lately. He knew Jungkook wasn't that type of person to lose control like this, but why was everything suddenly changing? He couldn't understand the reason of Jungkook's action, and for some reason he felt very scared. He sighed. Vine tore another paper. She was writing another song. It was her habit to write lyrics, and trust me, she was good at it. She scolded herself and tossed her pen away frustrated. She looked outside her window and saw Junko's manager there. She frowned and walked out of the room to meet him. The man smiled softly at her and came close to her as she opened the door. Soon she invited him inside the house. Vine nodded and gestured him to sit on one of the chairs in the living room as she sat across from him. She looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to talk. Vine stared blankly at him. It was such a surprise. Jungkook liking her? She said and tried to convince manager. Vine shook her head, denying that what she heard was true. There was no way Jungkook liked her. She sat and looked at him. Manager sighed at her statement. Vine agreed and bid manager goodbye before walking back to her room. Once she was done locking her door, she leaned against the door, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. She was trying to calm herself down, but all that kept running through her mind was why he is interested in me. She sighed. Junko leaned his back on the wall after practicing for 4 hours. His body was aching from all the dancing. He looked around the studio. He hadn't seen manager yet, or anyone else for that matter. The others left already because they were done by 12:30 p.m., which meant he was alone in the studio, which he didn't like at all. He always hated being alone. He growled and headed back to his changing room. Jungkook looked at all the outfits and got urged to meet Ryan again. He wondered why taking his phone out of his pocket, Ryan wasn't answering either of his call and texts. Maybe she needed some space and time to process what happened earlier. He hated it when someone ignored him and refused to reply to his messages, especially when he had been nothing but nice and sweet towards them. Ryan was peacefully working in his place when suddenly door burst open by Jungkook who come directly into not caring about anything else. Her brows frowned in irritation, but she stayed quiet as Jungkook stormed towards her desk where she worked. He stopped in front of her and glared down at her. He could feel rage boiling inside him. He wanted to hit something badly. She frowned and stood up. She shrugged and sat on her chair again, making Jungkook lost her laptop. He demanded, glaring. She rolled her eyes. Jungkook ignored her words. He was getting closer to YN and he hated it. Why was he so damn attracted to this girl? He saw her lips turn downward in anger. She looked straight at him, her face expressionless as she spoke. Her voice rose up a bit higher. He repeated. Now she was getting visibly annoyed. She finally blurted out. She exhaled deeply, calming herself. She scoffed. Jungkook blinked a couple of times. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked in concern. Jungkook nodded his head and left her alone immediately. Vian sighed and sat on her chair with a heavy heart. She took her phone from the table and typed the message. I did as you asked, then put her phone back down. After a few days, Miss Kim smiled at Vian proudly, seeing her new design. She looked very happy. She praised Vian thanked Miss Kim. Vian nodded her hand and grabbed her handbag. She followed Miss Kim in her office. Vian looked surprised. Jungkook smirked at her reaction and went close to her. Vian was little confused with his sudden attitude. She chuckled lightly, teasing Vian. She tried but couldn't seem to be formulate a sentence. Her mind was racing and she couldn't figure out what was happening with Jungkook. Vian widened her eyes at Jungkook. She couldn't believe her ears. She looked at Miss Kim in disbelief before looking back at Jungkook. She muttered unsure. Miss Kim smiled brightly and nodded her head at both of them.